The coffee machine gurgled and sputtered, breaking the silence of the office kitchen. I poured myself a cup, the bitter scent mixing with the lingering smell of bleach. Typical Monday. A flicker of movement caught my eye. It was him, my secret, my lover. He was talking to her, his wife, my colleague. They smiled, unaware of the bomb ticking away beneath the surface of their pleasantries. He glanced over, saw me, and his eyes shifted briefly. Was that guilt, or just a flicker of nervousness? My stomach churned, and I turned away to hide the flush on my face. It had been weeks since we first kissed, the thrill of it all like a jolt of electricity. At first, it was just playful flirting, light-hearted comments thrown across the office. Then came stolen moments behind the stockroom door, quick and intense. He was all I could think about. "Hey, you okay?" He appeared beside me, his voice low. He reached out, and I could see her staring at us from the corner of my eye. "Yeah, fine. Tired. That's all." I took a sip of my coffee, trying to swallow back the nervous lump in my throat. "Rough night?" He smirked. I knew what he was implying, and the heat rushed to my face again. "Don't," I hissed. "Not here." He retreated, a small quirk of his lips the only sign that my rebuke had hit its mark. For a moment, the thrill of the deception was back, like a forbidden secret only we shared. But then it was replaced by a dull ache of guilt. My husband, my kids. They swirled in my head, a stark contrast to the clandestine moments we snatched when no one was looking. This couldn't go on. I'd tell him, tonight. It has to stop. The weekend had been a blur of avoidance and secret, heated texts. I couldn't sleep, barely ate, jumpy at every little sound. My husband must have thought I was losing my mind. The lies felt like barbed wire wound around my throat, choking me. He'd be surprised, sure. Maybe angry or hurt. But then maybe he'd understand the way I hadn't, the way my life had felt stagnant, predictable. The way this other man had awakened something I didn't even know was gone. It was a desperate hope, a flimsy justification, but all I had to cling to. My heart pounded with every step towards home, a nervous energy humming in my veins. He'd know. My husband, with those kind eyes and the soft spot he always had for me, he'd look at me and just know that I'd been with another man. This wasn't a clumsy secret, it was a stain on my soul, one he didn't deserve. I hated myself in that moment. Each ring of the doorbell was like a drumbeat of doom. I almost couldn't bring myself to open the door, wanting to evaporate, to never face the inevitable storm. But I did. My husband's tired eyes met mine, and guilt washed over me like a tidal wave. The words tumbled out, clumsy and desperate. I confessed everything. The office glances, the stolen kisses, the lies I'd told while he slept beside me. I braced myself for his fury, his shattered heart. The silence stretched between us, suffocating. There was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, then a deep, wounded look that cut me to the core. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do this?" I had no answer. No excuses could justify this. No clever words could soften the blow. His tears weren't angry, just profoundly sad, and they stung more than any slap. He was shattered, and it was all my fault. He didn't leave, though. Didn't pack his bags. Didn't scream or swear. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with the pain I'd caused. "More than you can imagine. Let's just try, okay? Try to fix this." And that's how the real lie started. The smiles I plastered over the hollowness inside, the dinners where every conversation felt like walking on eggshells. He tried, God knows he tried. But every time he looked at me, I saw that flicker of pain in his eyes, the knowledge of my betrayal etched into his features. It poisoned everything, a constant reminder of my selfishness and the wreckage I'd left behind. And him, my lover, he became bolder as my guilt deepened, a silent threat woven into our stolen moments in parking garages and hushed phone calls in empty bathrooms. I couldn't stop, but I couldn't stay either. I was drowning in a sea of my own making, torn between a man who loved me unconditionally and one who stoked a fire I didn't know how to extinguish. Every smile I gave my husband felt like a fraud. We were playing house, pretending everything was okay while I counted the hours until I could see him again, my lover. Sleeping in the same bed as my husband became torture, his body next to mine a constant reminder of the love I had fractured. One night, it all came spilling out again. We'd had a decent day, laughed with the kids, watched some mindless TV, almost normal. But as my husband's breathing slowed beside me, I couldn't stop the tears, the guilt crushing me all over again. "I haven't stopped," I choked out the confession, my voice thick with sobs. I still see him. This time, it wasn't just sadness in my husband's eyes. There was a flash of anger, a spark of resentment burning beneath the hurt. The silence this time was tense, not sorrowful. You need to stop this, he said, his voice cold. For us, for the kids, it's not fair to anyone. And there it was, the first ultimatum. An icy dread settled in my stomach. But when I saw my lover the next day, everything melted away. His touch, the way he looked at me, it was wrong, but it was the only thing that felt real anymore. He promised, again, that he'd leave his wife, that we'd figure things out. His promises were like a drug, giving me false hope, pushing back the reality I couldn't face. I told my wife, he said one stolen afternoon. About us. Told her I want a divorce. My heart pounded with anticipation, fear mingling with excitement. This was it. I was both terrified and overjoyed. All the lies, the guilt, the whispered phone calls, they were finally going to lead to something, a new life with him. What did she say? I asked, breathlessly. He paused, and his eyes didn't quite meet mine. She's upset, he said, but she knows it's for the best, that it's been over for a while anyway. A small voice inside of me, the one I'd been desperately silencing, whispered a warning. Something felt off. But hope has a way of smothering reason. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. He was going to be mine. Weeks became months, a blurry spiral of stolen glances and whispered promises from my lover. He'd leave his wife, he swore, but always with an excuse. First there was work, then his kids, then vague family problems. Something was always keeping him from following through, and the excuses felt increasingly empty. The hope I'd clung to was fading, replaced by a dull ache of dread. At the office, I couldn't look at his wife anymore. The pity I'd once felt turned into resentment, then into disgust at myself for being a part of this charade. One evening, I went to his house. His wife wasn't home, some work function or another. The house was immaculate, nothing out of place. No sign this was the messy, crumbling home of a collapsing marriage he'd been painting for me. He was caught off guard, shocked to see me there. What are you doing here? You can't just show up. Why are you lying to me? My voice came out low and dangerous. For months, you said you were leaving her. What is this? He started sputtering, coming up with the same lame excuses he always did. That's when it hit me, a wave of bitter realization. He was using me. The affair was an escape, a thrill. He never actually intended to leave his comfortable life. I was the fool, blinded by my desperation and unhappiness. You're never going to leave her, are you? I said quietly, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. Leaving him that day felt like walking out of a nightmare. The air tasted cleaner, I could breathe again. But it was mixed with a deep, painful humiliation. I'd been played. But more than anything, I was furious at myself. When I got home, my husband was there, watching some stupid sports show. He looked up and smiled, and in that moment, all the reasons came rushing back. This was the man who still loved me despite everything, who looked after me and our children. I was the one who had thrown that away. I'm leaving you, I said. It sounded raw, even to my own ears. He was stunned. What? Why? I couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it. It's not working for me anymore. I'm not happy. The look in his eyes was a mix of confusion and deep pain. He didn't deserve this, any of it, but I couldn't keep living a lie. This wasn't about my lover anymore. It was about me, finally taking a step for myself, even if it meant breaking something else in the process. Packing my life was surreal, a mix of relief and a hollow kind of terror. My husband didn't try to stop me, just looked at me with that wounded sadness that had become his constant expression. The kids were a blur of confusion and tears as I said goodbye, promising to see them as much as possible. His apartment, when I finally got there, smelled of him, sharp and a little stale. It wasn't the homey warmth I'd built over the years, but I tried. Set out photos of my kids on the nightstand, made his favorite meal that evening. We were starting over, building a new life. Or so I told myself. The first few weeks were bliss. It was like being back at the beginning, all those thrilling moments of sneaking around, the rush of doing something forbidden. We went out a lot, showed off our new relationship like a trophy. He was charming, attentive, everything my husband hadn't been in years. But then, reality started to sink in. When the excitement dwindled, the same problems resurfaced. Turns out, Moving in together didn't fix them, it just magnified them tenfold. He was messy, leaving clothes and takeout containers everywhere. He seemed strangely hesitant about the divorce, still dragging his feet. And the worst part? Seeing his wife every day at work, that same forced politeness, it was unbearable. A constant reminder of the wreckage we'd created. Can you please just finalize it? I'd snap at him. It's been months. He'd always deflect, making excuses about lawyers or complicated paperwork. I started getting paranoid. What if he wasn't leaving her at all? What if this, like everything else, was a lie? Do you even love me? I asked one night, fueled by wine and frustration. He paused, looked at me with that same expression he used to give when I caught him staring at other women. Of course I do, he said, but it wasn't convincing. That's when I knew. With a sickening clarity, I realized he'd never really loved me. I was a distraction, a way out of his own miserable marriage. But now he was tired of the trouble, of the consequences. I was just the next problem in his life, and it was only a matter of time before he found a way out of that, too. Living with him turned into a daily battle. I'd explode into tearful arguments, fueled by despair and resentment. He'd shut down, withdraw into himself like a sulky child. The apartment we shared grew small, suffocating. The only escape was work, but even that was torture. Seeing his wife, the forced pleasantries knowing what we had done, it was eating me alive. My friends, the few I hadn't driven away with my lies and secrecy, were distant. I'd shut them out, too ashamed to tell them the truth about why my marriage had ended. My parents were furious, their disappointment echoing in the silence on the other end of the phone. I was alone, adrift in a sea of my own disastrous choices. One morning, I couldn't get out of bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling, a strange numbness washing over me. Why bother? What was the point? The questions were a dark tide, pulling me under. I stopped eating, barely slept, just a hollow shell going through the motions of a life I no longer recognized as mine. You need help, he said one night, after finding me crumpled on the kitchen floor, crying. There was concern in his voice, but also a trace of irritation, like I was an inconvenience. He was right. I knew it deep down. The next morning, it was my mom at the door, her face tight with worry. The hospital was a blur of sterile rooms and whispered conversations that didn't fully register. Depression, the doctors said. A breakdown brought on by stress, guilt, and profound unhappiness. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. Heavily medicated days, sleepless nights, and the ever-present awareness of how spectacularly I'd ruined my life. No amount of therapy, pills, or concerned visits from my family could undo the damage. He didn't even come to visit me at the hospital. Not once. The hospital discharged me with a stack of prescriptions and a referral to a therapist I couldn't afford. Leaving felt more like being kicked out than being healed. I went home to his apartment, the boxes of my remaining things stacked in the corner. The moment I stepped inside, the weight of it all crashed down on me. I couldn't stay there, not one more minute. My parents took me in, their initial anger replaced by a quiet, heartbroken concern. Days turned into weeks, a dull blur of sleeping late and watching mindless TV. One morning, I forced myself to get dressed and fill out a job application at the grocery store I'd worked at in high school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. Work was hard. My mind wandered, the depression lingered like a heavy fog, but the physical exhaustion was almost a relief. It meant I slept without nightmares for a few hours. My co-workers were cautiously kind, sensing there was a story behind my hollow eyes, but I didn't offer them one. Then there was Ben. He worked in produce, always cracking jokes and smiling easily. One night, after closing, he offered to walk me to my car. This neighborhood isn't the greatest after dark, he said, and you look like someone who could use a friend. I tried to deflect, make a joke about my resting sad face, but he saw right through it. Look, he said gently, I've got my own crap going on. We all do, but it doesn't mean you have to go through it alone. That simple act of kindness was the first crack in my wall of isolation. Coffee with Ben after work turned into weekend hikes, then dinners where I actually laughed for the first time in ages. He wasn't glamorous or exciting, but he was steady, patient, and refreshingly uncomplicated. One sunny afternoon, sitting on a park bench with ice cream cones, Ben turned to me. I like you, he said, his voice quiet. A lot. I just stared at him, unsure of what to say. He'd been so patient, waiting for me to rebuild myself at my own pace. I didn't want to hurt him, to disappoint him. But then again, maybe he was what I needed, someone real, someone good. I started slowly, choosing my words carefully. I think I like you too. Years passed. One careful, tentative step at a time, I began to build a new life. The marriage to Ben was quiet, simple. His love wasn't flashy, but it was steady and sure, a balm to my wounded soul. We bought a modest house, adopted a dog, and settled into a comfortable routine. Happiness, I discovered, didn't always arrive with an explosion. Sometimes, it crept in quietly, like sunlight after a long storm. And then, one ordinary afternoon at the grocery store, of all places, I saw him. My ex-lover, pushing a cart down the aisle, looking rumpled and slightly worn around the edges. His wife wasn't with him, and the flicker of unease in his eyes when he saw me confirmed that their marriage was still intact. A surge of anger flared in me for a moment, at him, at the unfairness of it all. But it quickly dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of indifference. The man standing in front of me was a stranger, a ghost from a life that no longer held any power over me. "Hey," he said, his voice slightly hesitant. "How are you doing?" "Fine," I replied, my tone neutral. "I'm actually doing really well." He looked like he wanted to say more, and a small, vindictive part of me wished he would. Wished he'd beg for forgiveness, or tell me how he regretted his choices. I wanted him to know how much he'd lost. But he didn't. Just nodded, then turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. I watched him go, feeling a flicker of something that might have been pity. He was no longer the exciting escape, the thrilling secret. Just a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destruction I'd left behind. As I loaded my groceries into the car, Ben appeared beside me, a concerned look on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I smiled, reaching for his hand. "Just ran into an old acquaintance. It's fine." And it was. Because in that moment, nothing about my past could dim the light of the present. I had Ben, my steady, good husband, and a life I'd built with my own two hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was mine. And that, I realized, was more than enough. Some days, the memories of the affair washed over me like a cold wave. I'd see a stranger with his hairstyle, hear a song that used to play constantly in my old apartment, and the guilt would come rushing back. There's a price to pay for poor choices, and the shame lived as a quiet echo within me. But then I'd look at my life. At Ben asleep next to me, the dog curled at our feet, the sunrise painting the world in soft pastels. And those echoes would fade, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. I had survived what I'd done to myself, rebuilt something from the shards of my broken life. It wasn't the same, never would be, but it was good. It was real. "You think about him much?" Ben asked one night. We were lying in bed, the darkness giving him the courage to ask the questions I knew lingered. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice soft. "Not like before, though. It's a part of who I am now. The good and the bad." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "It gets easier," he said. "Trust me." And I did trust him, with everything. He never judged me, just loved me steadily, with a patience born out of his own hurts. I'd learned so much from my mistakes. Learned that excitement fades, but true love endures. Learned forgiveness comes hardest for ourselves, not always from others. But most importantly, I learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. The past was still there, a shadow on the wall. But every day, as I chose Ben, chose the life we'd built together, that shadow shrank a little more. I wasn't sure if it would ever disappear completely, but I was no longer defined by it. I wasn't the same woman I was before the affair, but I'd become someone new. Someone better. Someone grateful. Someone ready for whatever life held next. Years blurred together. Birthday parties with cheerful chaos, quiet nights on the porch with Ben watching sunsets, backyard barbecues with friends we'd made as a couple, not just me alone. The ache of my past faded, replaced by the simple contentment of ordinary life. One afternoon, while cleaning out a dusty attic box, I stumbled upon a photo album. Old pictures of me and my ex-lover, smiling and carefree. I stared at the woman in those photos. She felt like a stranger, someone I used to be but didn't recognize anymore. With a resolute sigh, I tossed the album into the trash. It was time to let the ghosts go. "You okay up there?" Ben called from downstairs, his voice muffled. "Yeah," I shouted back, dusting my hands off. Just getting rid of some junk. The junk, I realized, wasn't just the album. It was the weight I'd been carrying, the fear of not being enough, of needing excitement to feel alive. Ben had helped me see that real strength wasn't in reckless abandon, but in the quiet commitment of choosing to build a life day after day, even when it wasn't flashy or dramatic. Work was fulfilling. I'd risen through the ranks at the grocery store, now a district manager, overseeing stores across the state. There was a satisfaction in using my brain, solving problems, feeling respected for something I'd achieved. It was mine, built with my own determination. Looking in the mirror, I saw the lines around my eyes, the sprinkling of gray in my hair. But instead of panic, I felt a sense of peace. These were marks of a life well lived, mistakes made and battles overcome. I'd finally found my place in the world. It wasn't the one I'd imagined when I was younger, chasing after impossible dreams and reckless passions. But it was better, because I'd built it on truth, on second chances, and on the enduring love of a good man. I was no longer the desperate girl trapped in a stagnant marriage. I was strong. I was independent. I was